Now let's talk about the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So, the brain is a very protected structure within the human body. It's mostly composed of a large mass of cells that we have referred to as neurons, but the greater amount of biological cells in the brain are a class of biological cells known as glial cells. Glial cells are supporting cells, they support the neurons, and they are more abundant within the brain and the spinal cord, um, more so than neurons themselves. If you think about the brain, it is a very protected structure. It is protected by cerebral spinal fluid, by layers of the membranes, by skeletal tissue known as the skull. And we are highly dependent on oxygen for our brains. We cannot have stored oxygen within the brain. We can't extract oxygen or energy um, from the brain. We need a consistent supply of blood, which brings in oxygen. And so, if we're deprived of this oxygen for seconds, we can go unconscious, lose our awareness, and greater than seconds, even minutes, ultimately can result in death. And so let's look at and first talk about very quickly a class of cells that we call glial cells. Now, remember, glial cells are cells, they're not neurons, and they're located within the CNS and the PNS, even though they're different types of glial cells in the PNS, and they make critical contributions. So within the CNS, within the brain and the spinal cord, there are three main classes of glial cells: oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, and microglia. And you see that these are cells, right? So they all have their cell bodies, and you see they all have different functions. Glial cells will help to wrap around myelin of the neurons, and this will also help for regeneration of myelin. Microglia are supporting cells located in the extracellular fluid and in its entirety, and they help to engulf phagocytosis, meaning engulf foreign object, foreign products, and so forth. So that helps to protect the CNS. And these are astrocytes with these end processes that help to maintain the structures of neurons. So they wrap around blood vessels, they also wrap around the axon terminals of the neurons. When they wrap around the blood vessels, they allow for pores, these junctions within the blood vessels, to be very tight, to be smaller. And so, therefore, there's not a free exchange of different substances that can be labeled as toxins going in and out of these blood vessels to affect the brain and the spinal cord. And so, when you think about the brain, I think many people will think of this picture to your left. This is a picture of an intact left hemisphere of the brain. Um, and if you look from the dorsal, the top down, you also see this kind of there's a little bit of what we call a midsection area where there's an indentation. But really, what you're looking at is you're looking at the cortex of the brain. You're looking at the outer structure of the brain made of these different sulci, um, which are these indentations, and gyri, which are these flattened parts. So, gyri, sulci. But really, the brain has subcortical tissues, sub as in like submarine. Underneath this cortex, if you're to chop the brain in half at this midsection, underneath the cortex is subcortical tissue. Again, in the cortex is subcortical tissue. The cells are neurons and glial cells. And a lot of the subcortical tissues, if I say these terms like hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, this just means that there's a group of neurons in the subcortical tissue that we in psychology have discovered that function for different cognitions and behaviors. So, for example, when you have fear and aggression, neurons within the amygdala get activated. When you are encoding your long-term memory, so learning and memory, neurons within the hippocampus get activated, and so forth. And so there's really a kind of a philosophical difference between the cortex's subcortical tissue, and that we like to think of the cortex as higher order cognitions, higher order behaviors. And so, what do I mean by that? Well, let's dive a little bit deeper into the cortex. There are 4 lobes of the brain, and these lobes are the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And the cerebral cortex is the outer tissue of the 4 lobes. And so the sulci and gyri is the outer tissue. And so basically, within this outer tissue, within the temporal lobe, within the cortex of the temporal lobe, the outer tissue of the temporal lobe houses a group of neurons associated with our ability to process the sense of hearing. Within a group of neurons in the cortex of the occipital lobe houses a group of neurons associated with the processing of vision. And within the parietal lobe, kind of this top part of the brain, the cortex of the parietal lobe houses a bunch of neurons that allow us to process the sense of the cutaneous senses, touch, vibration, and so forth. And within the cortex of the frontal lobe houses neurons that we tend to think of as higher cognition. These neurons get activated when we suppress inappropriate behaviors. These neurons get activated for attentional mechanisms. These neurons get activated for decision-making processes. These neurons get activated for moral reasoning. You name it, most likely neurons within the cortex of the frontal lobe are implicated in that cognition or behavior. And so this is how protected our brain is. We have this cerebral spinal fluid and the skull. The cerebral spinal fluid here has these very tough layers of membranes known as the pia, the dura, and the arachnoid membrane. And in here is the cerebral spinal fluid, which overlies the entire brain. And so basically, the cerebral spinal fluid, it has very few proteins and cells. It looks like water. And one way to diagnose mild traumatic brain injury is to collect sample from the cerebral spinal fluid to look at whether there is a misbalance of the positive and negative charges. And so now let's talk about the CNS from the spinal cord perspective. We're going to spend most of the semester talking about the brain. So the spinal cord is often forgotten, but it is directly connected with the brain. I dissected out the spinal cord from a rodent. And so what for you guys to see. And so what you see is the spinal cord, which is mounted on a slide. And I took microscopic pictures of it. This is the brain, this is the spinal cord. And what you see here, the spinal cord, it's not divided, right? It's an entire entity, but if you were to kind of chop the spinal cord at the different segments, you'll see that the spinal cord has this dark matter, right? Gray matter, white matter, which we'll talk about in a second. And so basically, this is the cross section of a spinal cord, and this dark matter and white matter. Remember, when it comes to neurons, all the anatomical structures of a neuron are located inside the CNS. So the spinal cord is in the CNS, and neurons are also in the CNS. And so this is called gray matter because the neuronal cell bodies, areas of a neuron, are darker, and the axons of the neuron is lighter. And so gray matter, white matter, right? Gray matter, white matter. And so, what if somebody has a full transection, meaning a complete severing? If you're to take the spinal cord and completely chop it in half, sever it at the high cervical level, this results in tetraplegia. That means that anything below the level of the transection is not functioning. Any type of sensory or motor responses. If this person is thinking they want to move their arm, the signals should go down to the spinal cord, but the spinal cord is transected, so it doesn't go anywhere. If you were to tap this person's arm, the signals will go from the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord, and then the signals should ascend up to the brain, but the spinal cord is not connected here. And so this would be indicative of a person with tetraplegia. And it's the same principle if there's a full transection, a full disconnect at the lumbar section. The same symptoms are associated with tetraplegia, except only localized to the lower limbs. And so many of you, I'm sure, have seen, or maybe you even know people who, or you yourself, have been in a wheelchair where you're kind of using your upper body strength to move that wheelchair, but you don't have any type of mobility or sensory motor responses in the lower body. And so basically, that's indicative of paraplegia.